Thank you for joining today's webinar put together by CIMI. We are going to talk about lean data approach in impact measurement. And I understand that this topic of impact measurement is something that we are all interested in, especially these days, as we are moving toward more focus on the idea of impact performance. So with that in mind, we have two guests for today's webinar. Maybe if both Pranav and Sayaka to show your face. Let me introduce you to Pranav Sridhar. He is the client success lead at 60 Decibels. He's joining us from London. Good morning, Pranav. And
hi, Katsuji-san.
Thank you for joining. And we also have Sayaka Takatsuka-san. She's a senior director at Shinsei Investment. ごめんなさい、新生企業投資. So she's joining from Tokyo. はい、高塚さんよろしくお願いします。
よろしくお願いします。
Okay. So we are going to start with the Pranav presentation for about 20 minutes, followed by Takatsuka-san's comments for about 10 minutes. And then we're going to have a short dialogue with the two speakers. And the last 15 minutes is allocated to the Q&A session. So with that, let me start with the Pranav. So Pranav, again, thank you for joining. So actually, at the Social Impact Day in January this year, we have like speaker from 60 Decibels, and this is the second time we are going to invite somebody from your organization. How do you describe this organization, 60 Decibels? We understand you may call it the impact measurement company. Is that the accurate way of describing what it is?
That is correct, Katsuji-san. And first up, thank you so much for having us again on this CIMI webinar. I recognize it's a little bit, towards the evening of all of your days in Japan. And so really appreciate all of you joining. That's correct, Katsuji-san. It is an impact measurement company. And fundamentally, what we do is we help a wide variety of organizations who care about social impact measure their performance. And we live in a world where measuring and tracking and improving financial performance is the regular day-to-day business for millions of organizations and companies around the world. But we want to create a world where measuring and improving social performance is as important and as possible for a variety of different organizations. And so that's what we do at 60 Decibels.
Thank you. I think one of the key words that you just mentioned is that not just measuring, but the measuring and improving social performance. So I understand that your company help your clients to really work on their social performance for improvement. So that's good to know. Also, we see your title as a client success lead. You're not a measurement director or anything like that. Client success lead. What does that title mean?
That's an excellent question, Katsuji-san. So just a little bit of background about myself. I've been with 60 Decibels now for over 3.5 years. And the core of what I do is impact measurement work, which is helping, foundations, impact investors, social enterprises, measure their impact, collect data, and use that data to manage their social performance. Now, recently, as of 3 to 4 months ago, the role I've transitioned into is really to think about two elements. One is how can we make that process seamless for the clients that we work with? And so having worked with a diverse set of clients, I'm now beginning to think about what are the impact measurement and management needs of different sets of clients and how we can design our products to be as user-friendly and as easy to take up for different types of organizations given their different needs. So that's one. And the second is to really grow the base and number and type and diversity of clients that we work with, because increasingly we want to be covering, investors that are based in South and Southeast Asia, for example, or investors that invest in a combination of climate or social performance or supply chain performance, and really be integrating stakeholder impact into all these types of organizations. So the second part of my role is really identifying the types of clients, the types of needs that exist, and seeing how 60 decibels and the services we offer can fit them. So in that sense, it's about making sure what we do brings success from a social impact and a social performance perspective to the clients we work with.
Great. That's good to know. And I think you're going to talk about your relationship with the client in your presentation. So I think that will clarify what do you do, what kind of impact measurement service you provide for your clients. Okay. And before you go to your presentation, my last question is, so the title today is Lean Data. What is it in a simple language?
So Lean Data is, if I was to break that up, is really about making the process of listening extremely simple. Our understanding of the sector is just that, impact measurement is often complicated because it's hard to sort of estimate impact and, think about what's the different elements to it and so on and so forth. And what lean data really means is how can we make it extremely simple to listen to the end customer or the end stakeholder and use that data to measure the impact we're having on their lives. So I'll walk through that in the presentation in more detail, but it's really a simple methodology to listen to the people who really matter the most.
Okay, that sounds good. I think that's something that we all want to hear, making the process of impact measurement extremely simple. That's good to know. Okay, so over to you, Pranav.
Thank you, Katsuji-san, and Takatsuka-san. It's a pleasure to be sort of on this presentation with you. Well, I'm going to sort of dive right in. Katsuji-san already sort of gave me an opportunity to introduce myself. Apart from my work at 60 Decibels, I also support a nonprofit based in Uganda called One Day Health, which is focused on delivering high quality primary care. And just from a background perspective, sort of have sort of a science and business background. But sort of with that, I'll sort of dive into what we're going to be focusing on in today's presentation. So as Katsuji-san mentioned, one of the things that, especially given the audience for today's presentation, recognize that there's, at the investor space, even with organizations or companies that are delivering for-profit services and nonprofits, there's an increasing need to think about standardized, actionable impact measurement methodologies. And so today, what I'm going to focus on is the entire life cycle of what it looks like to do impact measurement, right from making the choices about the approach to impact measurement, the process that we at 60 Decibels use for impact measurement as one approach to conducting this, as well as going through what it means to effectively select indicators, collect that impact data, and then real examples of work we've done with clients in using that data to measure their impact and manage that impact so that they can grow it over time. So that's really the scope of my overall presentation. Before I dive in, just a few notes for all of you. One is I sometimes tend to speak fast, especially when I get excited about what I'm speaking about. So if at any point I'm speaking too quickly, Katsuji-san or anybody else, please don't hesitate to stop me and ask me to slow down. And that I totally understand that.
You might already have.
Excellent. Well, I will keep that in mind.
Okay.
The second thing is, as Katsuji-san mentioned, at any point in the presentation, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put that in the Q&A box, because that way the questions can keep coming in, and I can sort of take them towards the end once the presentation is done, but I'll have the record of them. Yeah, those are just the two main things. And with that, I'll dive right in. So the first sort of key element of what I wanted to emphasize is in the work that we do, we observe three main approaches or philosophies almost to impact measurement, right? The first is what we call practice. The second is proxy. And the third, which is going to be the focus of today's presentation, is a more precise and precision-based approach to impact measurement. Now, as you know, I'll sort of dive right into what those are.
Pranav, just one thing. So
yes.
I think we are going to be able to share this presentation in a PDF format to all the registered participants after this session. Is that okay? Yeah.
That's correct. That's absolutely
okay,
right.
So everybody who receive the presentation afterwards. So thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And so if that means you don't, want to take, you don't have to sort of necessarily take notes necessarily of everything that I have on my screen because the presentation will be accessible to you. So coming back to sort of the three pillars, or sort of three ways, which is practice, proxy, and precision. The first one I just wanted to quickly touch upon is practice, right? And so this is something that's often used in ESG and other wider standards where companies try to understand the types of practices, whether it's governance practices or labor practices or employee practices that a company adheres to, assuming that if those practices are conducted or if they are followed, then they will lead to positive outcomes for all stakeholders involved, right? So in our experience, what this is good for is communicating an organization's priorities, sort of understanding what existing practices are in place, and so organizing existing data, and in some ways simplifying sort of the various elements of what an organization is achieving and sort of documenting that in a meaningful way so that as an external observer, you can understand how an organization functions or how it's run, right? However, in our observation and our understanding, it still doesn't constitute measurement of impact. And the reason for that is there is often a gap between best practices and outcomes. One good example we are recently seeing is in consumer protection. Just because employee trainings are in place, just because there are often call recordings of interactions between customers and employees, does not always mean that customer experience will be really good. It is indicatively helpful that those practices are in place, but ultimately we still need to speak to end customers or understand their experience to really determine whether those practices are achieving their intended outcomes. And so then we move on to the second commonly used sort of approach to impact measurement, which is proxies. And one of the most common proxies that we find is scale. Company X has sold X number of solar home systems in country Y, or company X has disbursed X amount of loans to Y amount of customers, and therefore is achieving a certain impact. And the example on the left here with solar home systems is just one example of how a proxy followed by calculations helps us arrive at a certain impact outcome. But again, this is good to sort of understand the scale or the breadth of reach of an organization. It is helpful to understand the scale of impact, as for example, especially with COVID-19, X number of vaccinations gives us a good sense of how effective a certain program has been. However, across other sectors and other contexts, once again, impact measurement is still missing. What I mean specifically is when solar home systems, for example, are provided to customers, how is it benefiting those communities? What are they using it for? Are they actually generating more income from it than they are paying back the sort of loans that they took to procure that product? Are there other negative consequences of using that product, right? All of these are ultimately what we need to understand to determine whether the product or service is achieving the intended outcome. And the second point is really around comparison of performance. Because if there's solar home system company A and solar home system company B, apart from this difference in their scale, there might be many other differences in the experience of their end customers. And that's why we at 60 Decibels are really keen on answering one important question, right? As you know, many of you are in the financial investing space, or as companies yourselves, which manage profit and loss statements, perhaps. The question is, would you be comfortable managing or measuring your financial performance based on proxies or practice? Likely not, right? You would want to understand whether or not your financial performance, which is the returns on your investments or the returns on how you spend your organization's funds, are achieving the intended financial performance. And that's what precision impact is trying to do, or a precision approach to impact measurement is trying to achieve. Now, what you see on your screen is a snapshot of the type of data that we collect for investors. CO1 to CO2, 22 here represents companies. So it basically is ranking the social performance of company 1 to company 22 as an example across multiple subsectors. And the reason, and we'll dive into more such concrete examples in a few minutes, but really what precision impact is trying to do is actually use social research methods like qualitative and quantitative surveys to really speak to end customers or beneficiaries, in the case of nonprofits, to understand the end customer impact and use that to manage social performance. What it's good for is ultimately measuring impact. And secondly, also using end customer perspective to inform which types of impact are more important to them and which types of impact are less important to them, because they ultimately are the decision makers of what constitutes good versus less good impact. And you know, this coupled with data on scale or the reach of an organization helps us get a more comprehensive picture of the impact that is being achieved. So that's really sort of the way I wanted to set this up, which is practice, proxy, and precision. And our work at 60 Decibels is within the precision space, and one of, we like to believe, the most effective ways to measure the impact of the work that organizations do. So
if I could just to stop you for one moment, Pranav, could
yes.
you go back to the last slide and then show us the graph, and then the horizontal bar, the axis is 0 to 100%. This is 0 to 100% of what?
Great question, Katsuji-san. So it can be 0 to 100% typically of customers. So what I mean by that is we ask a question such as, is this the first time you're accessing such a product or service? It's a question called first access, where we try and understand whether a company or a nonprofit is providing a unique, a novel service to an underserved community, right? It's one of the indicators that I'll talk more about. And the question is, company one, for company one, 99% of its customers are accessing the product for the first time, which means that they are truly reaching an underserved market. And so they can claim based on real data that they are serving an underserved community, versus company 22, only 16% of their customers are accessing it for the first time. So perhaps they are operating in a region where they already have similar access, or maybe as we collect other data, we could discover that it's in a center or an urban hub. And so on this particular indicator, company one is outperforming company 22, and that allows A, impact data, and 2, comparability across similar companies. Does that help?
Thank you. That's very clear. Thank you.
Okay, super. So and thanks so much, Kansuji-san, for stopping me. And I'll keep going now. But if there's anything as I continue that you have questions on or that you think would be helpful to clarify, please let me know. So that just brings me to who we are, right? Katsuji-san asked this in the beginning of the presentation, and I'd love to describe it in a little bit more detail. 60 Decibels, at 60 Decibels, what we really, really care about and what we want to do is make it possible to listen to anybody, anywhere on the globe, and do that to help measure the impact of products and services on their lives. They could be farmers, factory workers, urban or semi-urban customers. They could be individuals in rural areas, in semi-urban areas, in any part of the world. But fundamentally, the idea is, can we measure the impact of a loan, a house, an agricultural product on their lives, and use that data to offer better and better services over time to them? And so our work is really the foundation of our work is this lean data process that you see on the screen. And this is also the bedrock of the overall sort of journey that our clients go through with us. And so to your point, Katsuji-san, in the beginning, we work with both foundations and investors who want to measure the impact of their portfolio. And we measure the impact of individual companies and nonprofits who want to measure the impact that they're having on the end customers or the end communities that they are working with. And so the journey that we take them on is first defining the goals, or in other words, the specific impact that they seek to create. So for example, some organizations want to reach low-income customers. Some organizations want to reach a high proportion of female customers. Some of them want to increase incomes. Some of them want to increase farmer productivity. So based on what organizations care about, we help them define their goals and select indicators. Then we use our standard sort of survey tools and templates to design a survey that's helpful for this particular organization. We then have a network of researchers around the world who, through phone-based surveys, and that's important and an important part of the lean approach, which is the ability to do this at scale. And we currently use phone surveys very, very widely to collect the data. We then analyze the data in the ways that I just described, and sort of one snapshot that I just showed. And then we sort of actively work with the clients that we have to make sure that that analysis can inform, validating the hypotheses that they have about their impact, and also helping them identify opportunities where they can grow their impact over time. So that's really the journey, and I'm going to walk through that in a little bit more detail now. So the first element I wanted to sort of speak a little bit about is indicator selection. Now, what you see on your screen are three of our flagship sectors at 60 decibels: financial inclusion, agriculture, and off-grid energy. Now, one of the things you'll notice in these sort of spider or tetragonal images that you see on your screen is a variety of different indicators that go into these sectors, right? Now, these indicators have come from a lot of our work speaking to end customers. So our work began over 7 to 8 years ago, conducting pilot surveys across sectors with different companies to understand what all stakeholders care about. What are investors looking to impact? What are companies most interested in? And ultimately, what are customers most concerned with? What matters most to them in improving the quality of their life, right? And that's how we've arrived at a number of standard indicators that can help us measure the impact of different types of products and services. The second element to it is also linking that to publicly available standard standard protocols, like the impact management project, or the sort of the GIN itself, which is the Impact Investing Network, right? So there are frameworks out there that they have created, like IRIS, and we try and make sure that the indicators that we are capturing are aligned to them, but are also very measurable and actionable for the organizations that we work with. And so just taking one example, such as agriculture in the middle, right? One of this sort of framework that you see is just an example for one of the types of clients that we might work with, right? Which is a company that wants to provide farmers with access to a new service. So there we would measure first-time access and the extent to which that is being created, right? We would also fundamentally, many organizations in the agricultural space want to improve farmer production, farmer productivity, and farmer incomes. So that's what we capture in returns, which is, are there being financial returns to the farmer themselves? Then there's stress and well-being, which is, is there a way in which the organization is supporting the farmer manage cash flows, for example, or providing them insurance for climatic shocks, so that not only is there an improvement in their sort of long-term financial health, but in the process, are they more resilient to shocks, is something that we're able to sort of capture. And so these are just some of the indicators that we have in our database, but really the main thing to think about is what is the vision and the thesis of the organization that's working with the farmers? What are their impact goals? And then we are able to offer the right indicators that we can capture. And because we've been capturing these indicators over a long time, we're also able to, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, compare those outcomes to benchmarks so that organizations know how their performance compares to others in the same sector. Very quickly on data collection, and then I'll go into the real life examples of the data in action. So once we've actually designed the survey, we work with our network of researchers across the world. We have over 1,000 researchers across 70 countries around the world, and they are the ones who, in local languages, conduct these interviews. We sort of have them get on the phone and conduct 10 to 15-minute interviews with end customers. So if it's a farmer, hear about their experience with the company's product and service, and use that sort of to then determine the impact that we're having on their lives. And we have standard survey scripts, some qualitative, some quantitative questions, so that the data is comparable across multiple companies, multiple countries, and multiple sectors. So now I'm very excited in the last sort of 4 to 5 minutes to really dive into examples of how this data has been used. So the first example is at the company level, which is this one. And the next one for all of you investors is at the portfolio level. So at the company level, we worked with Salty International, which is a global organization that focuses on cassava, which is a particular crop from South America, but across sort of often grown in East and West Africa as well. And it's really about helping farmers get more access to the end customer with higher margins, with increased productivity. And so what Salty International does is work with farmers to procure cassava directly from them and sell it directly then to consumers, and process it and sell it to consumers. Now, what we did for them was speak with about 250 of their farmers in Nigeria who they work with to really understand the farmers' experience and the impact that Salty was having on their lives. Now, in this case, the impact was, or the data that was particularly helpful was the customer insights data or the farmer insights data. Basically, farmers felt that they were experiencing a lot of challenges transporting the cassava, because cassava has a lot of water content, and when transported long distances, it loses that water content and loses quality. And the second was that they were having lots of payment delays from Salty International themselves. And this is such a good example because it's an example of how business performance affects impact performance, right? Just because you're operating in an impact space does not mean you're always going to be having the same impact. And Salty, based on that data, very quickly sort of acted on it. They set up 3 processing plants that were smaller than their traditional plants, but closer to farmers so that they could procure it sooner. And they then also used a lot of this farmer data to get sort of specific working capital financing so that they could make payments to farmers on time. And that significantly improved sort of farmer performance and the impact that they were able to have on farmers' lives. So it's just a very good example of how listening is just independently valuable to collect farmer data, farmer experience data, and use that to manage the impact that Salty International is having on their lives. So that's at the company level, right? The next example is a little bit more complex. And before you get quite sort of taken aback by all the graph and all the arrows, I would love to explain it to you very briefly. So this is our work with AgriFin, which is an organization set up by the Gates Foundation and the MasterCard Foundation with the specific goal of using digital services to accelerate the sort of overall well-being of farmers around the world. And so what we did for them is we conducted about 2,500 interviews with the end farmers that 10 of their partner organizations serve. So think of yourself as an investor. In this case, you have 10 of your organizations say you've invested in, and you want to understand how those 10 organizations are improving or impacting the lives of the end customers, in this case, farmers. And so what we did for them is we conducted 2,500 interviews across Kenya, Tanzania, and Nigeria. And these companies were different, right? As you can see on the key right here, which I would love to have your attention on, some of them were in the training and advisory space. So how can they support farmers with best practices, right? A couple of them were in the farm mechanization space. How can they improve the farming sort of methods of the end farmers? And the other 4 were in market access, so connecting farmers to consumers at higher margins, and financial input, so either fertilizer and other input to the farmers, or actual financial support so they can sort of manage their farms. And so what we did for them was collect data on first-time access, an indicator that I mentioned earlier, poverty reach, so are you reaching low-income farmers, and gender, right? So are you reaching male or female farmers as your primary customer? And so this is when the data really comes to life, right? Because if you are an investor and you care about, particularly you care about, say, gender reach, right? Then this company right here is really reaching a large proportion of female farmers. But in fact, if what you care about is inclusivity, reaching poor farmers, then this is the company that is really important to you, right? Because it's performing the most well or the most effectively on inclusion. Because as you go to the right, inclusion is increasing. As you go up, first access is increasing. And as the size of the bubble increases, your female reach is increasing, right? Because this is how the data really tells the story of the type of impact that's being achieved. And so that's when you begin to be able to use the data to make decisions, either about the types of investments you want to make, or use the data to support your portfolio to be more effective in their social performance, right? And so hopefully those 2 examples give you a sense for how a company and a portfolio can benefit tremendously by listening to the people that you serve in a standardized manner. And that's what we help do at 60 Decibels. So with that, I'll leave you with the last slide, which is just one quote in the end, which says, "My children are able to go to school and I have money as a woman," right? Each of what I showed you, each of the slides, each of the examples comes from individual responses from individual people. And that's what makes this really, really powerful, because when rolled up, it has the potential to really, really inform some of the most important decisions we make in the impact space. Thank you, Katsuji-san. Back to you.
Thank you, Pranav. Great presentation. Before I ask Takasuka-san for her comments, I'd like to maybe address one question. So the question here is if when you ask the end beneficiary or customers, what questions you ask, are they fixed, and then, or are they different by your different cases, and who gets to decide which indicator or question to ask? So I asked you to show this slide, so because my impression is that in these 3 different sectors, there's some standardization already happening at by 60 Decibels, and then in agriculture, you talked about the agricultural cases after this slide. You have used these 6 indicator sets to ask questions. So that's how you can standardize and compare. That's my understanding. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, that's a fantastic question, and an important question to answer right up front when doing this exercise. So the primary answer is, and I like to draw the parallel to financial performance, because when you look at someone's balance sheet, right, or their income statement or their statement of cash flows, they are expected to account for it or report it in very specific ways. Let's say it's IFRS or another sort of international standard. And the reason for that is it's important for that standardization that standardization is important, because then it allows any decision making, whether a retail investor or an institutional investor, to look at that and determine the financial health of the company, right? Now, that does not mean that the company will not track other financial indicators. Maybe they care about the cost to acquire a customer or the lifetime sort of revenue coming from a customer, right? So that they can grow their businesses. And we have, a similar philosophy in social performance measurement as well, which is that there is a need for a core standardized set of indicators that allows for standardized year-on-year measurement, comparability to other organizations, and data-based decision-making for key individuals, or honestly, everyone involved, right? And in addition to that, there's also a need for specific questions unique to that business model or that country or that context, which allows the organization to use that data in the way they specifically need. So the answer is that some of our questions are standard, and now having done this, we've worked with over 600 organizations for the last 7-8 years, many investors, 1,000+ projects, and that allows a certain level of standardization, which we are bringing into the space. And that means that in every unique project, we might also do some amount of unique questions so that they get specific value and are able to use that the way they see fit.
Thank you. That's very good. So you have standardization happening, but at the same time, you are thinking about specificity, and customization is also important. So that's a combination. So I see another question, but maybe first I'd like to move to Sayaka-san for her comments, and then we can come back to this question from Suzuka-san at a later time. So I'd like to invite Sayaka-san.
Okay, so thank you very much, Pranav, for the interesting presentation. I think it was very informative, and I had lots to take memos, and I don't know what I am thinking about. I have prepared some. I have prepared some presentation for myself to introduce myself a little and ask some questions. But I think many of the comments and the questions will be something ad hoc rather than what I prepared, because there was lots to learn. Before going into the questions, let me introduce a little bit about myself. So again, thank you very much, Pranav, for the presentation. I'm Saya Takatsuka. I'm the general partner to two serial impact investing funds in Japan. And thank you, Imata-san and CME people, for arranging this today. Today, we mainly manage our second impact investing fund, so-called Hataraku Fund. Hataraku means to work in Japanese, and the fund focuses on giving solutions to the work itself or working environment. Just to make clear on our background, our co-manager is SIF, S-I-I-F, SIF, and we have 12 institutional LPs in our fund, expecting full market rate return at the level of the venture investment fund. Here are some of the our portfolio companies. We've invested into 6 companies in the first fund and 8 in the current fund so far. Portfolio includes education, childcare, HR tech, and medical tech, and etc. And so this is our fund's TOC, the theory of change. It focuses on social issues such as aging populations and challenges in shifting working style, all to create more diverse ways of working life. And this is a design of our IAM of the fund itself. In our IMM, the impact management, measurement and management, starting from the TOC, we identify the target investment area, which are childcare, elder care, medicals, and new working styles, as I said. And our challenge here is to make a good exit cases through our fund's impact investing practice, so that many traditional mainstream Japanese institutional investors would dedicate more budget to impact investing areas to make a better world. Many of the Japanese institutional investors are so cautious that they won't move from where they are today, sitting on traditional high-risk, high-return first-year investment funds instead of putting money to solve social issues. And we want to change that. Moving on to our impact practice, After a number of due diligence practices, we've come up with our own impact due diligence workflow and the templates as shown here. And as soon as we make an investment, and if the timing allows, actually, it depends on the investees as well, we try to put different KPIs in one table to understand the big picture before starting the impact KPI discussions. We try to identify which are the critical, the real key indicator for the core impact story of this company. And some other frequently asked questions are, which of them are already available as data in their system, or which are more wet and deep outcomes that we should follow by getting such data through user questionnaires and etc. I guess these questions are very typical. However, we haven't had a clear answer to all the questions so far, and I guess what I've heard today from Pranav was one of the answers to that. I think it was very, very interesting. And through the whole process, starting the due diligence, we emphasize that the owner of the impact measurement and management should be the investee itself, the business owner itself. And so the investees should plan well and make a good use of the deliverables from the IMM from its own purposes, for its own purposes. So I was asking to myself today, listening to Pranav, whether our IMM is at the practice or proxy level and hasn't gone to precision level. I think, and it will be a good learning for myself going forward, and I will keep on asking myself to each of the investee IMM whether it's really a precision or not. At the same time, it's to if we consider our goal of going to public, the company going to public for our investee companies. Oh, it's actually not a goal; it's a process. But one of the key goals there is to go to public for them too. I would say the lean data approach that Pranav has shown to us is very essential for IMM itself. But at the same time, we have to take into consideration how we disclose those data to attract market people as well. So I guess it's also important for institutional investors to envisage the final outcome as a disclosure. I wanted to understand a little deeper on this real essential make improvements in impact, overall impact versus how we disclose it, how we show it, how we decorate that and share with the stakeholders as well. So I wanted to understand a little bit more on that balance, if that's possible. I also had prepared some other questions to Pranav, like our facing issues are, for instance, while our stakeholders include the end users of the product, we would like also to avoid any unnecessary contact to end users to minimize their burden. So maximizing the user experience should be the top priority for the business. So the question would be maybe how should we design a questionnaire that does not harm user experience? So that was one question I had to Pranav. Imata-san, should I go on to the questions I had, or shall I go like one by one?
Well, I guess we can start with these two questions. So you put forward two questions so far. I think one is about disclosure and reporting. And then, of course, this is a context within the context of in Japan, like people like Sayaka and others really striving to make this more known among the investors, and especially in the listed equities and then traded companies. So how can we promote the disclosure of impact so that it attracts the investors that are interested in of course, good impact performance. So maybe the question for you, Pranav, is in this lean data methodology, how does it serve for that kind of purpose? So the second question is, Sayaka spoke about the burden on the end users. Of course, that's something we all worry about when we try to get firsthand impressions and experience data from the end customers. And maybe that's why you have this very lean approach to really minimize the burden on the end customers. So we'd like to hear your comments about that. So let's start with those two.
Absolutely, Katsuji-san and Sayaka-san, thanks so much for that presentation, and also for your sort of very, very honest sort of reflections on the sector and the work that's sort of happening in the investment space. Just to emphasize, we recognize that, practice and proxy have tremendous value. And they ensure sort of business and financial performance, because there's clearly data to show, for example, within ESG, where G performance is very high, that it translates to financial performance, and so that data is there, and so we value it. And I also would love to think about ways in which we can support in moving more and more organizations to the precision space, because we know that they find value. It's just
I think you are speaking a little bit too fast.
Excellent. Thank you, Katsuji-san. It's my sort of fatal flaw.
It's good, but okay.
So absolutely, I was just very, very glad to hear your perspective on that, Sayaka-san. So thanks so much for that. On your first question about disclosures, I think it's a really, really important one, and I think the short answer is that probably, I think it's something that would need to evolve as an overall alignment of the sector, really. But I guess my one thought is two things. Before even thinking about disclosure, the one thing that we often find is that the due diligence stage, which is private still, is a great place to start, because that is a place where, we try, any investor tries to screen out, a company that had, you try to mitigate risk, right? You try and identify any factors that might affect the long-term financial performance of the company and mitigate those risks. And so, for example, poor governance or sort of predatory labor practices, these are all risks to the health of the organization. And so the first place I think that we would love to see more precision approaches is in that stage, because that data typically stays internal and is helpful for decision-making purposes. So that's one. But then when you think about companies going public, right, I think what we really would like to see is almost like a certification setup. So almost like you need to have, a check mark on making sure your relationship with broader stakeholders is in fact at par with the sort of just the type of organization that you want to be. And there as well, like increasingly there are certifications for climate, right? So, buildings or your entire sort of network being sort of say LEED certified or other such certifications. And so I think the answer really is a certification that is agreed upon, at least at the national level, and ideally like the IFRS at the international level, so that speaking to end customers and understanding the positive and the negative externalities is fed into the disclosure, right? Now, of course, at this point, it's hard for me to determine exactly what that looks like, but I imagine, to your point, that not all the data that's collected would be disclosed, because not all the data that would be collected would be easy to be interpreted necessarily, because some of it probably is helpful for internal decision making, and some of it probably is critical for the broader community to be aware of. So I think that's just my reaction. I don't think that perfectly answers how we would do disclosures, Sayaka-san, but hopefully it's indicative of where we need to head to do that well. So that's on your first point. Any further questions there, or should I move to respondent burden?
Actually, I don't know whether I should make a connected question to that, and we will never come back to the second question. How do I do? Actually, I had one question to that, additional question to your answer just now. You talked about the certification, and before that you said there's an interpretation, right? And I guess that part, interpretation, is very important when we consider, well, not only disclosure, but when we use that for management, we need to interpret what the measurement, what the measurement was meant to be. So we often use a professional interpretation with co-working with academic background people to do that. Do you coordinate the measurement result with academic interpretation, or how do you think, how do you design the co-working with the academia?
Again, thank you so much for that question, Sarika-san. The short answer is we do collaborate with academia on various instances, right? The one thing we are trying to do is trying to balance practical, actionable goals and academic rigor. And the reason I say that is, one of the sort of quintessential examples of academic rigor is a randomized control trial for public programs, right? It's not necessarily in the financial space, but more in the government or the nonprofit space. And while we recognize that they have tremendous value to sort of validate the efficacy of a certain program, we find them extremely cumbersome to actually implement from a regulatory or a disclosure standpoint for sustainability and impact measurement. And so the reason I share that spectrum is only to say that we work very actively with academics to constantly refine the method, the tool, find more effective ways. For example, one of the primary places we collaborate is in poverty measurement, because the World Bank is constantly updating the types of sort of poverty lines it uses, or the proxies it uses, or the measures it uses, etc. And we need to stay up to date with that as well. So we are constantly collaborating with academics to determine how best we can measure poverty in different countries around the world and how we can compare that. For example, in some places we do quasi-experimental studies to validate whether a methodology is even working or not, right? And so those are the ways in which we collaborate with academia. But on the other end, we try and make sure we're constantly in touch with investors, companies, and work with them, because that's where we see this approach being utilized. And so, yeah, it's literally in the middle of the two is where we collaborate with both sides.
If I could jump in, about this too. I mean, one of the comments I'm sure you hear about lean data is that, you are collecting data from the end customers. It's all subjective data. And then how, I think it's necessary to combine the subjective and then more like, people in the academia will use, more like population data, what income level, poverty is one thing. So what's your response to that kind of a remark or sometimes criticism?
Again, thank you for that, Katsuji-san. I will say that a few things. So one is, just want to emphasize that we absolutely find certain academic methods very, very valuable to measure or to validate the outcome or the value of different kinds of programs or initiatives. But one of the things that we also believe is that just because something is subjective, in no ways makes it less valuable than quote unquote objective data. And the reason I say that is because subjective data is so, it's such a powerful reflection of human experience. And what we are trying to do is when we capture that at scale, we are able to sort of create that spectrum of what good subjective and poor subjective experience is. So that's the first. But the second is, when subjective data is collected across millions of people, that does start to become objective. And the reason what I mean by that is, loosely speaking, if I'm collecting data from, say, 100,000 Indians or 100,000 sort of Nigerians year on year, and compare that across similar companies, then some of those biases apply to all of them, right? And so that's when the comparison becomes particularly important. And what I mean is, company A's impact performance is subjective. Company B's impact performance is also subjective. So if, for example, and we've heard this critique, which is, and coming from India, one of the things we always believe is that Indians have a very high bar for customer experience, which means that the net promoter score, which is a proxy for satisfaction, tends to be lower in India. So that's understandable if I'm comparing an Indian social enterprise to, say, a Kenyan social enterprise, right? But if I'm comparing 150 Indian social enterprises, then that bias starts to get controlled for. And so that's one of the ways in which we try and control for that bias, Katsuji-san. But we're constantly finding ways to identify how to make sure that that subjective data is comparable, is standardized, and is truly meaningful for impact measurement.
Okay, right.
What actually is the line that the subjective data comes to objective data? What's the line? The amount or percentage, or what's that? Well, I don't know. I don't think there's a general one only question, but one only answer. But how should we?
Yeah. That's a tough question, Sayaka-san, and I really appreciate it. I mean, I think from a practical standpoint, what I would imagine, and that's just my sort of thinking about it with the work that we do, is when the work that we start doing begins to reflect a truly representative group of people who we're trying to reach. What I mean by that is, let's just take a very specific example. So one of the things we're doing right now at 60 Decibels is the microfinance index, right? What it means is we are using the same set of indicators to measure the impact performance, access performance, resilience impact of different microfinance institutions around the world. And so last year we did this with about 72 of them. This year we'll do them with hopefully 100 plus and grow that over time. Now last year, the organizations that we worked with reflected about 15% of the world's microfinance borrowers. Now, while that's fantastic, it's not enough. And what I mean to say about that line, the really good point you made, Sayaka-san, about going from subjective to objective, in 3 years' time or 4 years' time, if the work that we're doing represents 80% of the microfinance borrowers around the world, and we're speaking with 500 MFIs, then that comparability starts to kick in, because we can not just compare to the global benchmark, we can compare to the Kenyan benchmark, within Kenya, a regional benchmark. And then I think that objectivity really starts kicking in, because you start seeing that you are really comparing your performance to very similar players and a very large population. And so I don't know if there's a magic number, but I think there's that momentum beyond which you've really covered the sort of not the entire universe, but like a representative universe of customers when it becomes very representative.
I think we can cover her next question, but before doing that, maybe we can also cover questions because it's also a methodological question. So the question is, are you using observation method, not just listening what they think or how they are, but do you use that approach as well?
That's a fantastic question. I think, so the short answer at the moment is no. We focus primarily on listening. However, I completely realize, there's a very well understood difference between stated preference and acted preference. And so what we do might be very different than what, sometimes what we say. And so, the few ways in which we think about changing that is, to your point earlier, Katsuji-san, which is that ultimately listening data needs to be used in conjunction with other kinds of data. So for example, especially with digital products, right? We try and constantly correlate usage data with the impact data to determine how reflective it is of the experience, which is, for example, you would assume that people who are using, say, a fintech app regularly are the ones who are probably experiencing greater impact because of it, right? The question is that true? We help test the assumptions by listening, but to your question, Soto-san, the observation element is very important as well. It's very, very important. And, physical observation we find to be increasingly not scalable and not feasible, and also a little bit intrusive from a privacy standpoint. But when we have other forms of data, whether it's location data, whether it's usage data, whether it's interaction data, we use that in combination with listening data to sort of say a more holistic picture of impact performance.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's cover Sayaka-san's second question, which is about the burden on the end customer by asking, by trying to listen to them.
Again, I'm just really appreciating the really good and the great tough questions Sayaka-san's presenting, because they are so important, and we think about it all the time as well. So a few things on burden. So the first immediate answer is there is some burden. There's no doubt about it, right? Because we are asking for 10 to 15 minutes of their time to share their experience with us. So that's just a given. What we work with is how can we minimize that burden, number one, and number two, how can we make it an absolutely voluntary choice of the respondent to share their feedback, right? So the first is, actually I'll do the second one first, which is consent. Every one of our surveys begins with a very, very clear description of the objective of the survey, why we do it, and the fact that it's entirely voluntary with no negative repercussions if they choose not to do it. And so that way the respondent has, the ownership is with the respondent. They get to choose, or he or she gets to choose whether or not they would like to participate in the survey, and it's only then that we proceed. The second thing is that all of the individual questions are also voluntary, which means that if someone is uncomfortable answering question 3 or question 12, they can skip it and move on, because ultimately they need to be comfortable sharing their experience. The third is minimizing burden in other ways. So we try and make sure that the interview can happen at a time that's convenient to them. So if they'd like to be called back, or if they'd like to suggest a time, we're very happy to do that. If they're only able to give us some responses, while not ideal, we'll take that too. And the last thing I'll say is increasingly, we're also innovating with other forms of data collection, not just phone-based. So, I don't know how prevalent WhatsApp is in Japan, but, it's one of the tools that we found to be quite prevalent in different geographies. And so we might conduct shorter 4 or 5 question WhatsApp-based surveys, or a shorter IVR survey, where they answer a few questions and they can hang up, right? So I think the goal is very much aligned, Sayaka-san, which is how can we go to a place where the experience of sharing data is a smooth one, a seamless one, and a burden-free one. It's just, we have to go, we're on that journey right now, and we started with phone surveys because it's the most effective to get qualitative data as well. But we are striving to reduce the burden on the end customer. And sometimes we do it very well, sometimes less so, and we're learning how to do that better over time.
Great. Okay. With that, we only have 4 minutes left, so maybe we would like to hear some concluding remarks from Sayaka-san, and then on to Pranav.
Thank you very much. I think this last 1 hour was very impressing, I would say, to me too. I really had a first impression, like Imata-san said somewhere, that okay, how do you convert the subjectives to objectives and etc. Subjectives. But I understood Pranav's background is scientific background, and as I heard Pranav explaining about the lean data, it was all about the compiling data and talk about the data in the end, right? So I guess that was very interesting. I think I will go back to our team, to our fund, and say, okay, aren't we too like narrow-minded? What shall we do next, and etc. So I guess that will certainly utilize to our IMM designing going forward. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Sayaka-san, for your commentary and for your set of questions and for your participation. Okay, Pranav?
Thanks so much for those kind words, Sayaka-san. And I would be delighted to sort of speak with you and others in this webinar today in more detail over time to sort of explore and understand what your sort of experiences are and challenges are. And so from my end, the sort of concluding thoughts really are that ultimately our goal is to make impact measurement just part and parcel of doing good business, doing good work anywhere and everywhere in the world. And so in order for us to do that, it's always incredibly valuable to understand the challenges that investors, that companies, that nonprofits, that end customers face with sort of measuring their impact, with understanding how their work is impacting the world around them. And so, as you know, the points you made, Sayaka-san, about disclosure, about interpretation, about when the data begins to really, become objective for decision making are all really, really important reflections. And so, I would just sort of encourage sort of everyone to think a little bit about what this process could look like and envision the future of it, because we always would love to understand what are the ways in which we can make that more and more possible, because we realize we have some way to go, but it's an important journey. It's a very, very critical one, because that's only when as an overall community, as a sector, we will be creating positive change. So yeah, just welcome all those thoughts and questions and ideas, and would love to stay in touch.
Great. Thank you very much, Pranav from 60 Decibels, and then Takasaki-san from Shinsei Corporate Investment to be the speaker for today. Today, we really learned a lot about the approach of making the impact measurement very extremely simple by listening, and how we can actually make use of that. Of course, it's really something that we will continue to discuss. And I hope that our partnership with you, Pranav, and the 60 Decibel will continue. So thank you very much for your participation. And thank you, everybody, for participating in this very insightful webinar. So thank you.